Hello and welcome to today's Fat Tail Daily video. Today we are joined by Nick Hubble. Usually he's with us on a Friday, but he's switching with Brian this week. Not sure why. How you doing, Nick?
Yeah, good. It's because I'm moving back to Australia at last. That's why we had to swap on
Yes.
Thursday evening. We're coming back to the Sunshine Coast.
Oh, fantastic. And you're going to be there for how long?
Just over a year, probably. Depends how the English goes for my little kids.
Yeah, right. Well, I'm sure they'll be very proficient. Do they speak German yet?
No, just English and Japanese. My German's probably not good enough to be teaching them.
Oh, cool. Well, today we're talking about, your piece today. It's fascinating. It's also a little bit provocative, I guess, about the growing tensions in renewable and energy policy, particularly at the state level. You draw some parallels between what's happening in Scandinavia, where Norway and Sweden are pushing back against European power interconnection, and what that might and how that might unfold here in Australia too. What's particularly interesting is how this isn't really playing out in the way that many people expected. Go figure. Instead of federal policy driving change, we're seeing state governments starting to resist energy policies that might disadvantage their voters. Again, go figure. As you put it, Nick, democracy works by competition between governments, not within governments. Now, this has significant implications for investors, especially given Australia's ambitious plans for interstate power interconnectors and the renewable energy integration to the grid and so forth. So I thought we could explore this and try and understand what it means for investors. So let's start. Nick, you highlight how state-level resistance to renewable energy policies is creating tensions, particularly around the interconnector infrastructure. How do you see these political dynamics potentially affecting investment opportunities in different Australian states?
Yeah, I think that there's going to be a bit of a battle between the different state governments in Australia and between the state governments and the federal government. Because the way renewables work is by creating a very large grid that allows them to combat the intermittency of the weather. So it might be windy in one part of Australia and sunny in another, and the idea is that you move the power to where it's needed from where it's being produced by these renewables, which are inherently intermittent. The trouble is that this creates some odd political incentives. So if you're a state government that has pursued energy reliability over renewables, then you're sitting pretty with very reliable energy. The problem is you've got to move it to the places that have made a big bet on renewables, and if they don't have enough power because the wind isn't cooperating, then suddenly they get access to your reliable energy policy. And the political incentives there are really messed up. They're really misaligned because states are able to rely on another state's good energy policy or reliable energy policy, while also getting the benefit of their cheap renewables. And this is already breaking down, partially in America, but in the last few days or last week in Europe, it's completely broken down in quite a unique way, with countries that have bet on reliable energy sources rather than renewables deciding that they actually might not want to be interconnected to places like Germany that have made a big bet on intermittent renewables, because this means they import the problems from those countries.
Your analysis of Sweden and Norway's experience presents an interesting warning for Australia too. Beyond the obvious energy utilities, what sectors or companies might be affected by similar emerging tensions here?
Yeah, the companies building a lot of this energy infrastructure are the ones that are in trouble, I think. We were assuming that there's going to be an absolutely enormous rollout of energy infrastructure, of grids, of transmissions, of all these big high voltage direct current lines, connecting countries, connecting continents, connecting the different states within the US and Australia. And all this had to get built, and it was actually, under my calculations, the biggest infrastructure projects in history by a long shot. So several fold larger than the Great Wall of China, which is the next closest infrastructure project. And so this seemed like a really good investment trend. I think it might still be a really good, it is still a really good investment trend. But these companies are going to be getting a lot less government support and orders, if I'm right, if the renewable energy system starts to break down, because countries don't actually want to import energy problems from those places that have bet heavily on renewables. They don't want the instability of the grid. They don't want the instability of prices on that grid. They don't want the power fluctuating back and forth. They don't want to bet that the weather in one part of the country or continent will offset the weather in the other part of the country or continent, because sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you share the same lack of solar and wind energy at the same time, and then you're in trouble, right? And I think this realization is no longer theoretical in Europe. A similar breakdown happened in the US over the last few years. And I think that realization is yet to come to Australia, but the way that Europe is experiencing this allows investors to understand and react early before the politicians, even in Australia, figure out that Queensland might not want to share its electricity with its southern neighbours after those southern neighbours have been over-investing in renewables and then criticising Queensland for having reliable energy, for example. There's going to be this battle between those state-level governments because at a federal level, all of Australia is in the same basket, but at the state level, you are able to pursue slightly different energy policies, and that's what has happened in Australia between the states. And this competition means, pursuing a sensible energy policy, if that doesn't get you anywhere because you're just going to have to export your reliable electricity, then what's the point of being sensible, right? There's no incentive to. And the only way to secure your own electricity from a sensible electricity policy is to not agree to export it. It's a similar story with the gas, right? Australia contracted to export its gas to places like Japan and Asia and all these sorts of places. And so we have this domestic shortage. Well, what if a state government's able to avoid that sort of crisis by having a sensible energy policy when it comes to electricity? I think that's what's going to happen in Australia, or at least the threat. And because that is what has happened very recently in Sweden and Norway.
You also make a good point about the incompatibility of nuclear and renewable energy. Can you just explain that before I go on to my next question?
Yeah. So the solution to the intermittency of renewables is supposedly baseload power, and the form that's carbon-free is nuclear power. And so the idea is that all these problems with the renewables-based intermittent grid will be solved if we have enough nuclear power. And I would argue that is not true in a system that is very interconnected and very reliant on renewables. And this is what Sweden's discovered recently. Even though they've got plenty of nuclear power, they were smart enough to keep their nuclear power going and even invest in more. They are still connected to the disastrously messed up German grid, and therefore their power prices are going bananas. I think 18,000% higher in one part of Sweden than another because of this interconnector they have via Denmark. So the point being that even if you have a lot of nuclear, and if you're still connected to places that don't have a lot of nuclear and that have a lot of renewables, you still get the massive instability. You don't escape that problem of these vastly fluctuating prices, vastly fluctuating supply, vast amounts of money that needs to be spent on an electricity grid that can move all that renewable energy around. So nuclear is only an effective solution to the intermittency of renewables if it's a lot of nuclear and a little bit of renewables. And there's a report actually that came out of Japan very recently, in the last few days, which points this out. And a small amount of solar is great because it's very cheap. But the more you get, it becomes actually the most expensive form because of all the batteries and backup you need. There's a couple of other reasons why nuclear is not effective when paired with renewables. The cost of the grid, if you're going to have some nuclear power, the biggest advantage of that is the grid you don't need to build to make renewables work. You don't need all these high voltage cables going all across Australia, all across Europe, all across the US, because you can control which power stations provide how much power, when and where to build them. If you're going to build that massive electricity energy grid anyway, because you've got lots of renewables, then adding some nuclear power to that doesn't avoid that huge infrastructure build that you're going to get. So what's the point? Another reason is that right now, the way the system works is that we prioritize energy produced by renewables. So if there is enough renewables electricity, that's what gets used first, and then gas cycles up and down to adjust for that. Where's nuclear going to fit into that equation? Are we going to increase and decrease the amount of nuclear power used based on how much renewable energy is producing? Well, if we do that, then nuclear suddenly becomes very cost inefficient, because the key benefit of nuclear power is that if you run it full scale, full capacity, as much as you can, then it becomes cheap. But because it's very high fixed cost and quite low variable cost, if you only run it at some small capacity factor, so say 60%, then it suddenly becomes dramatically more expensive. So nuclear is uniquely badly matched with renewables for that upcycling and downcycling. Gas, for example, your biggest cost is the gas that's coming in that you're paying to burn. So when you use less electricity from your gas power plant, your costs go down a lot. So it's uniquely well matched with renewables for upcycling and downcycling. My real point here is that the electricity grid that works as carbon-free is one that's dominated by nuclear. So say more than 70% nuclear. With renewables doing lots of stuff, great, fine, that makes sense. But they can't be the dominant factor because of their intermittency. When you have an electricity grid based on an intermittent power factor, all sorts of other things start to happen that are going to cause chaos. And if you hook up your nuclear power plant to that chaos, you're going to get chaos. It's not going to solve the problem that comes with so many renewables. Hopefully, governments are going to start to figure this out, and we're going to stop ignoring places like France that have huge amounts of nuclear energy. So they have vastly more stability, vastly lower emissions, vastly less price instability than places like neighboring Germany.
That was an awesome answer so that establishes the conflict between the two power sources and the issue that you see coming. So my next question to that was, for investors currently exposed to the energy sector, how might you suggest that they think about this conflict and potentially position themselves for it in a better way for the longer term?
I think the news out of Scandinavia is really important because those two countries, well, Sweden has already rejected a power cable to Germany. Norway is considering no longer using the power connections to the UK and Denmark, which is pretty much a direct sabotage on the EU's renewable energy policy. If you can't move electricity around the grid in Europe, then you can't have a renewables-based grid because you need that ability to make the adjustments to intermittent energy function, especially Norwegian and Swedish hydro and nuclear power. Mm-hmm. If that starts to break down in Europe, I think it breaks down everywhere else, right? And so the question is, well, if countries don't want to share their electricity, then renewables don't work. So what are we going to do? And I think the only viable solution is this large-scale nuclear. So I think nuclear is going to go from being a small part of the energy mix in the intention or the plans of governments to being the dominant part. You know, once it's acceptable politically, why would you go to 20 or 30% nuclear? It doesn't make any sense. Why not go to 90, 70, 80%? So that you have, predictability, reliability, price stability, and so on and so forth. Why would you still muck about with renewables and introduce that instability and introduce the need to build a vast infrastructure grid? So I think, and this might be more of a long-term play, we're on the cusp of everybody realizing that if it doesn't make sense to have some nuclear, it makes sense to go a huge amount of nuclear. And renewables infrastructure and renewables power supply facilities only last about 20 years, which is about as long as it would take to get nuclear up and running. So there's an opportunity there. You know, we can decide in 20 years' time to rebuild all the windmills we've built and all the solar panels, or we can decide to have a bunch of nuclear power plants ready for when that renewable energy comes online. So I think there's a good chance now of nuclear becoming the dominant energy source, which means there would be an absolutely vast boom in nuclear-related energy picks.
Just a final question, Nick, back to the political side of things. So the comparison between state competition and competition within government, I thought that was quite an interesting point you made. As this dynamic plays out, like what early warning signs should people watch out for that might signal a shift in energy policy direction?
Yeah, didn't we have a few months ago one of the premiers say, that one of the other states can't even keep the lights on, and they were arguing about whether one state should have to keep a coal power plant online just so that the power could be exported to another one, which is basically covering up the bad energy policy of another state, right? I can't remember who was involved or which states. It must have been Victoria and New South Wales. But this has already played out to some extent in Australia, where premiers are ridiculing each other's energy policies and saying, well, I'm not going to cover up your bad energy policy by keeping my coal power plant running. That's the sort of thing I'm expecting. Also, go slow work on the energy interconnection grids across the state borders might be a big one. There's some issues in northern Queensland about the copper string. What's the name of the project up there? Anyway, local communities might be rejecting that. In the UK right now, they have just overhauled whether councils and local government can reject planning permission for some of these energy projects. So that's the opposite direction which the UK is going in, because they're changing government over there. I'd expect the reverse to be happening in places like Europe, Australia. In the US, we've already had some bizarre events like, I think it's state governments suing the likes of BlackRock, so a big investment company, for refusing to finance local energy projects that were fossil fuel based for only backing renewables projects. So these sorts of infighting between state governments, federal governments, between different state governments inside the US and obviously national governments in Europe are rejections of higher level energy policies that are passed down and handed down. Some political infighting between leaders and sort of snarky comments. Obviously, in Canada, they had the issues with oil pipelines. All this sort of stuff is going to escalate rapidly. And those parts of the world that have pursued sensible energy policy, like Sweden with nuclear, or like Norway with its hydro, they will start to reject connections to the parts of the world that have pursued renewables, and this will cause that broader breakdown to occur.
Fascinating. All right, look, we'll leave it there, Nick. If you would like to read Nick's original piece, as always, the link is below. Nick, thank you, buddy. Will this be the last time we chat before Christmas?
It might be. It's up to you. We could have one more in the pipeline if you like.
Ooh. Why don't you, the viewers, let us know? If you'd like to hear another chat before Christmas, chuck it in the comments. We'll make it happen. Let's make it happen anyway, because I find it quite interesting. Cheers, buddy.
Thank you.
Nice to talk to you. Take it easy. Thanks for tuning in to Fat Tail Daily. If you're ready to take a new approach to building wealth, avoiding the same old mainstream ideas and investigating new market trends, then make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you don't miss a single video. And as a thank you, we've got a free report just for you. It is packed with actionable insights that show you how to capitalize on an alternative investment idea that you'll unlikely find anywhere else. You can download it right now by clicking on the link in the description below. So, if you're ready to discover strategies that the traditional market just doesn't offer, grab your free report. Until next time.